It was the laughter that I remember most. Not the kind, warm laughter that fills a kitchen, but the sharp, brittle kind that men use when they want to put a woman in her place. My sister Ada and I stood before the probate desk in Prosperity Gulch, our bonnets held in our hands, while the town clerk, Mr. Abernathy, read our grandfather's last will and testament. He read it with a barely concealed smirk, his voice rising with theatrical pity as he reached the final bequest. To his beloved granddaughters, Clara and Ada, he left the entirety of his worldly holdings, the deed to the old, abandoned silver claim he'd spent 30 years digging into the side of Mount Sorrow, a place the townsfolk had long ago christened Henderson's Folly. A ripple of amusement went through the assembled men. Sheriff Brody, a man whose authority was as wide as his belt, cleared his throat. "Well, girls," he said, his voice soaked in condescension. "Looks like you're property owners." Of a hole in the ground, the laughter that followed was like a volley of stones. Ada's hand found mine, her grip tight and fierce. I kept my eyes fixed on a crack in the floorboards, tracing its path as if it were a map leading anywhere but here. We were 18 years old, orphaned since the fever of '78, and now the proud inheritors of a joke. The mine had produced nothing but dust and disappointment for our grandfather, a man the town considered an eccentric at best, a madman at worst. He died in his sleep a week prior, and his passing was seen as less a tragedy and more a quiet closing of a strange chapter in the town's history. Now that chapter was ours. We were to be the Folly girls. We left the probate office without a word, the sound of their mirth chasing us down the dusty street. We had a small room above the bakery, paid for by the church charity, but we knew that charity would not extend to two able-bodied women who now, technically, owned land. The inheritance was not a gift, it was an eviction notice. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the jagged peaks, Ada laid our few possessions on the threadbare quilt. 2 dresses each, a shared wool shawl, our mother's Bible, and a small tin box of mending tools. "They think we'll fail," Ada said, her voice low and hard as granite. She wasn't looking at me, but at the dark shape of Mount Sorrow visible through our small window. It loomed over the town, a constant, silent judgment. I didn't answer. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot coal in my stomach. I saw their faces again, the smug satisfaction, the pity that felt more like contempt. Our grandfather had been a gentle soul, full of strange ideas about geology and wind patterns, ideas that had earned him nothing but scorn. He saw things others didn't, and for that, they called him a fool. It seemed the title was hereditary. "What choice do we have, Ada?" I finally whispered. "We have the deed." "We have what he left us." She turned to me then, her eyes, the same deep brown as my own, holding a spark of something I hadn't seen before. It wasn't fear. It was defiance. "Then we'll go," she said, folding a dress with sharp, deliberate motions. "We'll go live in our hole in the ground. And we will not come back until we can buy this whole sorry town and turn it into a pigsty." It was a wild, impossible boast, born of shame and fury, but in that moment, it was the only thing that felt like hope. The next morning, we walked out of Prosperity Gulch with everything we owned on our backs, heading for the mountain that had been our grandfather's obsession and was now our only refuge. The laughter had faded, but its echo followed us all the way up the winding trail. The climb to Henderson's Folly was arduous. The trail, once wide enough for a mule, had been reclaimed by stubborn mountain grasses and fallen scree. For years, no one had bothered to come up here except our grandfather. As we ascended, the air grew thin and sharp, smelling of pine and cold stone. Prosperity Gulch shrank below us, becoming a neat little grid of rooftops and fences, a world that had spat us out. I felt a strange sense of relief with every upward step, as if we were shedding the weight of its judgment. Ada was silent, her focus entirely on her footing, her jaw set. She was the practical one, the anchor. I was the dreamer, the one who had spent hours listening to grandfather's theories about the Earth's deep currents and hidden energies. He used to say the mountain had a pulse, a slow, warm beat you could feel if you just paid attention. I pressed my hand against a rock face, feeling only the chill of the high altitude, and wondered if he had finally lost his mind up here in this lonely place. It took us the better part of the day. By the time we arrived, the sun was casting long, skeletal shadows across the landscape. The entrance to the mine was a dark slash against a sheer cliff face. It looked less like a beginning and more like an end. But to its side, tucked into a natural alcove and built against the rock itself, was a small, sturdy-looking cabin. Its walls were thick-cut timber, its roof a clever extension of a stone overhang, covered in sod. A thin curl of smoke was still rising from its stone chimney. It was a shock. We had expected nothing but a tent or a lean-to. Grandfather had been living here, truly living. Inside, the cabin was one room, but it was clean and orderly. A narrow cot was pressed against one wall, a small cast-iron stove in the corner, and a table hewn from a massive pine stump stood in the center. But it was the other things that held our attention. The walls weren't decorated with pictures, but with maps. Strange, intricate maps of the mine's interior, drawn with a draftsman's precision. They were covered in notes and calculations, arrows indicating airflow, and symbols I didn't recognize. On the table, laid open as if he'd just stepped away, was a thick, leather-bound journal. His final entry was dated 2 days before he'd gone down to the town for supplies, the trip from which he never returned. It read, "The deep warmth is stable. Channel beta is complete. The lung breathe steadily now. They will need it, even if they do not know it yet." It made no sense. A lung? Channel beta? Ada picked up a strange-looking tool from a workbench, a long metal rod with a cup-like device on the end. "What was he doing up here, Clara?" she murmured, her pragmatism baffled by the scene. This wasn't a mine. It was a laboratory. That first night, we huddled together on the cot, listening to the wind howl outside. It was a lonely, terrifying sound. We were 2 girls in a cabin on the side of a mountain, with nothing but a dead man's cryptic legacy to our names. But as I drifted off to sleep, I thought I could feel something, a faint, rhythmic vibration through the stone floor, a slow, steady pulse, just as he had described. Or maybe, I thought, it was just the beating of my own frightened heart. The days that followed were a blur of work and discovery. We had to survive. Ada, with her innate practicality, took charge of our immediate needs. She inventoried Grandfather's surprisingly well-stocked larder, sacks of beans and flour, tins of salted meat, jars of preserved vegetables. She found his hidden cache of firewood, neatly stacked and seasoned. She learned the quirks of the iron stove and figured out how to bank the fire so it would last through the night. While she secured our physical world, I fell into our grandfather's mind. I spent every spare moment poring over his journals, cross-referencing them with the complex maps on the wall. It was like learning a new language. He hadn't been searching for silver, not for years. He'd found a small vein early on, enough to fund his true project, but he'd abandoned it. His obsession was geothermal. He wrote of a vast network of volcanic vents deep within the mountain, a place where the Earth's inner heat leaked towards the surface. He called it the mountain's lung. He believed this energy could be harnessed, not just for warmth, but for life. The mine wasn't a mine anymore, it was a conduit. The tunnels were not just tunnels, they were airways, designed to draw the deep, warm air upwards and circulate it. The strange symbols on the map began to make sense. They marked vents, regulators he'd built from scrap metal, and chambers designed to trap and hold the heat. He was an engineer, I told Ada one evening, my fingers tracing a complex diagram of what he called the primary convection loop. He wasn't digging for treasure. He was building a furnace. A furnace powered by the mountain itself. Ada looked up from the sock she was darning, her expression skeptical. A furnace that doesn't burn wood. Exactly, I said, my voice filled with an excitement I hadn't felt in years. Look here. He sealed off the old silver tunnels to create pressure, forcing the warm air through this new network he dug. He built regulators, like little doors, to control the flow. The cabin's chimney isn't just for the stove, it's part of a larger exhaust system that pulls the cold air out, drawing the warm air in. That's why the cabin is so well built into the rock. It's part of the machine. She put down her mending and came to stand beside me, studying the map. Her practical mind began to connect the abstract lines to the reality around us. That faint rumbling we hear at night, she said slowly. That's it? The lung breathing. I think so, I whispered, a sense of awe washing over me. Our grandfather wasn't a fool. He was a visionary. A genius, living in exile, working on a project no one could understand. We were living inside his life's work. The thought was both comforting and daunting. He had left us not a worthless whole, but a complex, living system. The question was whether we were smart enough, or strong enough, to become its keepers. The scorn of the town seemed very far away then, a small and petty noise in the face of the mountain's deep and silent power. Our first real test came sooner than we expected. Autumn gave way to winter with a sudden, brutal snap. A storm rolled in from the north, not with snow, but with a wind that felt like it was made of razors. The temperature plummeted. The firewood we thought so plentiful now seemed meager. The cabin, for all its sturdy construction, began to bleed warmth. The cold seeped through the floor, through the glass of the single window, making the air ache. For 2 days, we kept the stove roaring, feeding it constantly, but it was a losing battle. We were trapped in a bubble of shrinking warmth, the vast, killing cold of the mountain pressing in on all sides. On the third night, the water in our bucket froze solid. Ada's face was pale, her lips tinged with blue. "We can't keep this up," she said, her words fogging in the air. "We'll burn through all the wood in a week." Desperation was a cold stone in my gut. I thought of our grandfather's journal. Channel Beta is complete. I grabbed a lantern and one of the maps. "I know what we have to do," I said, my voice trembling but determined. "Come on." Ada looked at me, then at the dying fire, and nodded. We bundled ourselves in every layer we owned and stepped out of the cabin into the mine entrance. The main tunnel was frigid, the rock walls slick with ice. But I followed the map, counting offside tunnels, until I found a passage that was roughly boarded up. Scrawled on the wood in charcoal was a single letter, Beta, Channel Beta. "This is it," I said, my breath catching. It took both of us to pry the frozen planks away. As the last board came loose, it was like opening an oven door. A wave of warm, humid air washed over us, smelling of damp earth and minerals. It was not hot, but it was profoundly, blessedly warm. It was the mountain's breath, real and tangible. We followed the tunnel deeper, into a large, cavernous space. The air here was almost balmy. In the center of the chamber, a faint steam rose from a network of fissures in the rock floor. This was the heart of his system, a primary collection chamber. According to the map, a series of vents connected this chamber directly to passages running beneath our cabin floor. He had built a secondary regulator, a large, wheel-like device set into the rock wall, to open those vents. It was rusted and stiff. We put our shoulders to it, grunting with effort, our muscles screaming in the cold. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, grinding groan, the wheel turned. We heard a distant sound, a low whoosh, as a new artery of warmth was opened. We scrambled back to the cabin, our hearts pounding. The change was immediate. The stone floor, once frigid, was now radiating a gentle, steady heat. The oppressive chill in the air began to recede, replaced by a comfortable warmth that felt like a miracle. We had done it. We had stoked our grandfather's hidden furnace. That night, we slept without the stove, warm and safe for the first time in days, listening to the gentle hum of the mountain breathing all around us. We had not just inherited a home, we had inherited a secret. And in that moment, we understood that this secret would be the key to our survival. That first victory changed everything. It was no longer about mere survival, it was about mastery. The fear that had been our constant companion began to recede, replaced by a growing sense of competence and purpose. Winter settled in for good, burying the world in a deep blanket of white, but inside our mountain, we were warm. We spent the long, dark months learning every inch of our grandfather's creation. We became explorers of our own home, our world defined by the tunnels and chambers he had carved. With his journals as our guide, we mapped the entire system, clearing debris from vents, oiling the stiff regulators, learning to balance the flow of air for maximum efficiency. Ada, ever the practical one, saw the potential beyond simple warmth. In one of the larger, steam-filled caverns, she noticed a constant, dripping source of water from a fissure high on the wall. It was a hidden spring, warmed by the same geothermal energy. Water, she said, her eyes gleaming with an idea. And warmth. And soil. Clara, we can grow things. It seemed impossible. Growing food in the dead of winter, inside a mountain. But we hauled in soil from a sheltered spot near the entrance before the ground froze solid. We built shallow beds and planted the few seeds we found in our grandfather's stores, stubborn, hardy things like potatoes, carrots, and kale. We used lanterns to supplement the dim light that filtered down a natural shaft he had widened. And to our astonishment, tiny green shoots began to push their way through the dark soil. Our subterranean garden became our secret joy, a patch of impossible life in a world of white death. We settled into a rhythm, our days governed not by the sun, but by the needs of our unique home. We maintained the vents, tended our garden, and spent the evenings reading from our mother's Bible or our grandfather's journals, our education a strange mix of scripture and thermodynamics. We rarely thought of Prosperity Gulch. It felt like a lifetime away, a place of small minds and cold hearts. We were the Folly Girls, and we were thriving in our folly. On the rare occasion a trapper passed nearby, he would report back to the town that the Henderson girls were still alive, holed up like badgers in their mountain. This only confirmed their belief that we were strange, half-wild creatures. They couldn't imagine our warmth, our light, our small, miraculous harvest of winter carrots. They saw a hole in the ground and pitied us. We saw a living, breathing sanctuary and felt only gratitude. We were self-sufficient, and more than that, we were content. The world had cast us out, and we had found a better one. Our grandfather had not left us a burden. He had left us a kingdom. A hidden, warm, and utterly private kingdom, carved from rock and genius. And we were its queens. We learned the mountain's moods, the subtle shifts in pressure that foretold a storm, the change in the pitch of the airflow that meant a vent needed clearing. We were no longer just living in the mine, we were a part of it, as essential to its function as any gear or lever. The mountain was our protector, our provider, our home. And we were its keepers, tending to the slow, steady rhythm of its warm and secret heart. The storm that would change everything arrived in the second week of December. It began not as snow, but as a sky the color of a bruise. The air grew heavy and still, an unnatural silence falling over the mountains. Even the wind, our constant companion, seemed to be holding its breath. Inside the mine, we felt it too. The airflow through the vents became erratic, humming with a strange, high-pitched anxiety. "Something is wrong," Ada said, looking up from the garden bed she was turning. "The mountain is uneasy." I checked the barometric gauges our grandfather had built, crude but effective devices of glass and mercury. The pressure was dropping faster than I had ever seen. On his maps, he had made notes about weather patterns, theorizing that the massive thermal variations on the mountain could sometimes create their own weather systems, what he called white hurricanes. He had written it as a theoretical danger, a worst-case possibility. We soon learned it was a reality. The snow began that afternoon, small, harmless flakes at first. But within an hour, the world outside the mine entrance was a churning vortex of white. The wind returned with a terrifying roar, a physical presence that shook the very rock around us. It wasn't a storm, it was a siege. We sealed the heavy wooden door at the cabin entrance, the one our grandfather had built to withstand avalanches, and retreated into the warmth and safety of our inner world. For 2 days, the storm raged. The sound was deafening, a constant, shrieking howl that vibrated through the stone, a stark contrast to the steady, gentle hum of the vents we were so used to. We had no way of knowing what was happening down in the valley. We could only imagine the flimsy wooden structures of Prosperity Gulch and the smaller settlements of Miller's Crossing and Flat Creek, exposed and vulnerable against the storm's fury. Our grandfather had written about the folly of building in the open valleys, susceptible to the whims of the mountain's weather. No one had listened. They had built their lives on flat, convenient ground, never thinking to look up and respect the power looming over them. We tended our garden, kept our vents clear, and we prayed. We prayed for the people who had mocked us, for the men who had laughed, for the women who had pitied us. We were safe, cocooned in the heart of the mountain, a place they had called worthless. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. On the third day, the wind died down, though the snow continued to fall, thick and heavy. A profound silence descended. It was in that silence that we heard it. A faint, desperate sound from outside. A shouting. Ada and I looked at each other, our eyes wide. It was impossible. No one could be out in this. We made our way to the entrance tunnel and listened at the heavy door. The shouts were clearer now, weak and hoarse, but definitely human. "Hello. Is anyone there? For God's sake, help us." Ada's hand was on the thick iron bolt. She looked at me, a question in her eyes. We were safe. We were hidden. Opening that door meant letting the world we had escaped back in. But the cries were becoming weaker, swallowed by the snow. It wasn't a choice. It was a duty. Together, we drew the bolt and pushed the heavy door open, into the changed and frozen world. The sight that greeted us was one of pure devastation. The world was an ocean of white, the snow drifted into massive, sculptural forms that erased the landscape we knew. And struggling through a deep drift near our entrance were three figures, barely recognizable as human under layers of caked snow and ice. One of them saw us and stumbled forward, falling to his knees. It was Deputy Miller, Sheriff Brody's second-in-command. His face was a mask of frostbite and desperation. "The Henderson girls," he gasped, his voice a raw croak. You're alive and warm," Ada said, her tone flat. "Get them inside." We helped them stumble into the entrance tunnel, their bodies shivering violently. The other two were a farmer named Peterson and his young son. They stared at the dry, warm stone floor of our cabin as if it were a hallucination. They looked around at our tidy home, the gentle steam rising from a kettle on the stove, the soft light from the lanterns, and their eyes filled with disbelief. "How?" Miller whispered, his teeth chattering. "The whole valley is gone. Frozen solid. Roofs collapsed. Prosperity, it's gone. Miller's Crossing, Flat Creek, all of it." He told us the story in broken fragments. The storm had been a cataclysm. It had flattened barns and torn roofs from houses. The cold that followed was even worse, a deep, penetrating freeze that no fire could keep at bay. People were trapped, freezing to death in their own homes. He and a small group had set out as a last, desperate gamble, remembering the tales of the madman's mine on Mount Sorrow. They didn't expect to find us alive. They were looking for shelter, any shelter, even a cold hole in the rock. They had found a miracle instead. "There are others," Miller choked out, his eyes pleading. "Down the trail. We lost some, but there are maybe 20 more. Women, children. Sheriff Brody is with them. They won't last much longer." Ada and I didn't hesitate. We loaded the men up with blankets and hot broth in tins, and I grabbed the detailed map of the mountain surface trails our grandfather had made. "There's a sheltered path," I said, pointing to a route that hugged the cliffside, protected from the worst of the drifts. "It will be hard, but it will get you there and back." Ada looked at Miller, her expression hard. "You tell them the Folly girls sent you." As they left, renewed with a sliver of hope, we began to prepare. We cleared out the largest cavern, the one with the garden, making space. We brought down every blanket we had. We put a great pot of water on the stove to boil for broth. Our quiet, two-person kingdom was about to have visitors. The laughter from the probate office echoed in my memory, a ghost from another lifetime. The world had turned upside down. The fools on the mountain were now the only hope for the wise men of the valley. Our grandfather's legacy was about to be put to the ultimate test. Over the next few hours, they came. A slow, miserable procession of survivors, half-frozen and shell-shocked, guided by Deputy Miller. They stumbled into the warmth of our mine like souls entering the afterlife. Their faces were a mixture of awe, confusion, and shame. These were the people who had whispered about us, who had laughed at our inheritance. Now, they looked at us with a desperate, pleading reverence. We led them into the main cavern, where the gentle warmth and the impossible sight of a green, living garden met them. Some of the women wept at the sight of it. Children, who had been silent with cold and fear, began to stir and look around with wide eyes. Ada took charge, her voice calm and authoritative, directing people to sit, wrapping them in blankets, handing them mugs of hot broth. She was a general commanding a weary army. I moved among them, tending to frostbite with the salves our grandfather had made from mountain herbs, speaking quiet words of comfort. They looked at me, at Ada, and then at the cavern around them, trying to understand. This place, this folly, was saving them. Sheriff Brody was among the last to arrive. He was a broken man. His fine coat was torn, his face was gaunt, and the arrogance had been scoured from him by the storm. He stood before me, his hat in his hands, snow melting from his shoulders onto the warm stone floor. He didn't look at my face, but at the walls, at the vents, at the evidence of a genius he had scorned. He wasn't a fool, was he? He said, his voice thick with emotion. Your grandfather, no, Sheriff, I replied quietly. He wasn't, we laughed, he said, finally meeting my eyes. His were filled with a terrible, humbling clarity. We stood in our warm houses, and we laughed at the man who was preparing for a day like this. My house is gone, Miss Henderson. My town is gone. Everything we thought was strong and sensible is buried under 10 feet of snow. He looked at the families huddled together, the weak steam rising from their blankets. And this hole in the ground, it's the only thing left. You and your sister, there was nothing I could say to that. The truth of it was all around us, in the warm air, in the crying of a child, in the quiet gratitude on the faces of our neighbors. The folly had become an arc. In the days that followed, a new community was forged in the heart of the mountain. The survivors, stripped of their property and their pride, had only each other. The social order of Prosperity Gulch dissolved. The banker's wife worked alongside the blacksmith's daughter, peeling potatoes from our garden. Sheriff Brody, once the town's highest authority, took orders from Ada on how to reinforce a tunnel. There was no currency here but work, no status but a willingness to help. Ada and I were no longer the folly girls. We were the keepers of the warmth, the providers of the food, the interpreters of the mountain secrets. We taught them how our grandfather's system worked, how to read the pressure gauges, how to tend the vents. We showed them the hidden spring and the miracle of our winter garden. It was our home, and we shared it. One evening, Sheriff Brody approached me as I was checking the regulators in a far tunnel. We owe you our lives, he said, his voice still carrying the weight of his new humility. When the snow melts, if it melts, we'll have to rebuild. But not in the valley. Not like before. We need to build here. With the mountain, not against it. He was looking at me, but he was seeing the future. A new town, a new way of living, born from his predecessor's folly and his own ruin. I thought of our grandfather, alone up here for all those years, working towards a future he would never see, a future for people who had called him a madman. His work was not for himself. It was for this moment. They will need it, he had written, even if they do not know it yet. He knew. Somehow, he had known. The bitterness I had held in my heart for this town, for these people, began to dissolve in the steady, geothermal warmth. It was replaced by something else, something I had not expected, a sense of belonging. We had not been cast out. We had been sent ahead, to prepare the way. When the great blizzard of '83 finally broke, it revealed a world remade. The valleys were scoured and buried, the old towns nothing more than frozen lumps under a blanket of white. But on the slope of Mount Sorrow, a new community had been born, warmed by the very heart of the earth. They didn't rebuild Prosperity Gulch. They built a new town, and they called it Henderson. They built it around the entrance to our mine, with respect for the mountain's power and an understanding of its gifts. The mine, our grandfather's folly, became the town's heart, its public square, its winter garden, its eternal furnace. Ada and I never left. This was our home. We taught the children our grandfather's science, and we taught them his story. We saw the town grow, strong and resilient, its people bound together by the memory of the great storm and the shared miracle of their survival. I am an old woman now. Ada has been gone for 10 years, and the mine is run by the town council, its systems maintained by engineers who study our grandfathers' journals as if they were scripture. I still live in the little cabin by the entrance. Sometimes, on cold winter nights, I walk into the main cavern and I see the ghosts of our past. I see 2 young girls, frightened and alone, discovering a legacy of warmth. I see a procession of half-frozen survivors, stumbling towards a salvation they never believed in. And I see my grandfather, his hands covered in rock dust, smiling quietly to himself. They say that what a society throws away is the true measure of its wealth. We are a world that is quick to mock what it does not understand, to dismiss the visionary as a fool, to discard what seems useless. We laugh at the hole in the ground, never thinking to ask what lies at the bottom of it. My question to you is this: what is your mountain? What is the inheritance you have been given that the world has told you is worthless? What is the folly in your life that you have been told to abandon? Perhaps it is a strange idea, a quiet passion, a skill no one values. I am here to tell you to go to it. To climb its trails, to learn its secrets, to tend to its hidden fire. Because in the deep, forgotten places, where no one else is looking, you might just find the warmth that will save you, and everyone around you, when the great blizzard comes.